inequality with women and girls in Colombia. And I'm going to be doing this through a couple of frames of reference. I'll be briefly explaining kind of generally what are the general perceptions of Colombian women and inequality as far as education and economics are concerned. And then I'll move on to inequality as viewed by like including Colombian women in peace talks and organization building. So that'll be the approach, and let's get started. So Colombia, since the establishment of the Constitution in 1991, there were just a few important things for feminism. And autonomy. Women have full suffrage. They're able to vote. They're able to hold office. They're able to work outside of the home. They should have fair wages. They should have equal right to education. And they have marital rights. So the husband doesn't completely dominate the whole relationship. And what we find most often in Colombian society, especially, was that these things were maybe guaranteed in name, but weren't actually being really used to their whole benefit. So a lot of Colombian women consider Colombia a machista society, which very male dominated. Women really are completely dependent on their husband and their family and their father, and the roles as workers tend to be within the home, and they're not usually allowed to work outside of the home. Typically, they don't hold as much land or capital, and they also tend to not receive as good as an education as the men do. So, let me go back really quick. Part of being in this machista society, there's also a lot of violence against women. So, in 2014, there were over 1,000 femicides in Colombia, which just means homicides that were targeted specifically toward women. There were over 40,000 cases of spousal abuse. And then there were 16,000 cases of sexual abuse. And the most kind of shocking part about that is that of those 16,000 cases of sexual abuse, almost 90% of those cases were reportedly against adolescents or children. So we also find that this occurs more often in poorer classes and in more rural environments because there's not as much of a government structure for taking them to court or even real response to the issue. So one group of women that is kind of interesting to look at within Colombia, and as far as feminist and women's rights go in Colombia, is the women who fight for FARC, the insurgent group. So FARC is Marxist-Leninist in ideology, and it kind of asserts a hard line of pro-feminist, pro-bodily autonomy for women. And so that's kind of the party line. The story is kind of blurred at some points whether that is actually coming to fruition there. So within FARC, FARC is about reportedly between a third of FARC combat members to almost 45% of the FARC guerrilla force is actually just women. Many women report that they came to FARC because they wanted to kind of overthrowing the neoliberal establishment. And an important aspect in those women coming to fight for FARC is the ideology of insurgent feminism, where women are trying to escape oppression at home or oppression by society, and most of all, oppression from classism and the capitalist system. So it is feminism and women's rights, but it's viewed through a lens of class struggle. So uh, there is their essential goal is to challenge and transform pro-women policies and do kind of like a almost a structural transformation of the way Colombian society works. So with the closure of the war in Colombia, hopefully, um, there were peace talks in Havana in Cuba between FARC and the government. And basically we get to see this really big inclusion of women in peace talks, which is something that is kind of been contentious in political science, I guess, is the feminist perspective in IR say that wars are more likely to occur because men are at the reins of governments, and there is kind of a male-dominated viewpoint in IR. But so interestingly enough, women were a very important part of those peace talks in Havana. The FARC platform going into Havana was really interesting as well. They kind of clarified that one of their primary objectives were assisting women in reintegration in society, moving from combat to regular life. And they're essentially saying that when that reintegration occurs, women need to move forward with the same rights as men. So it can't be just, okay, these women are going to go from combat troops to exactly where they were before, where they were dominated by the family. They couldn't really own property very well and that kind of thing. So the women's role, the women actually being there in those peace talks was really interesting as well. Over to the left here, we have Victoria Sandino, who was a former FARC commander, and she was an important part of a gender subcommittee that was created by these insurgent feminists and the insurgent feminist wave in those peace talks. And so that gender subcommission was created to kind of review what women's issues were and the challenges of transforming those policies at the peace talks into actual action based on the capacity of the government and the capability and the funding. So those are essentially the three worries. It's like we can talk about pro-women policies like the Constitution of 1991 did, but is the government actually going to be able to have the capability to move forward with those policies? So the peace agreement, actually, when it came forward, it was a kind of a big success for both sides. And one of the big things that they agreed on is it clearly states that sexual violence is never pardonable in Colombian society. So that is, I mean, I guess how you look at it, it can't be a bad thing. So one group that tends to be more disenfranchised than others, and this group is part of FARC, but throughout Colombia, women of color, indigenous, and Colombian women of African descent tend to be the most marginalized women because there's a combination of racism and sexism that comes into play. They usually live in violent areas. In Cali, Colombia is one of them, where there's a big Afro-Colombian community. And these women tend to be even more discriminated at schools, and they're given less job opportunities. And one of the big things about this is even though FARC has a big kind of pro-woman policy, and they accuse the government of not really contributing to women's rights at all. A lot of Afro-Colombian women were not included in the peace process whatsoever. They tend to be against these neoliberal land policies, and they want dedicated land to use their culture and the way that they deem appropriate. Ownership of land doesn't really kind of vibe with the way that they want to use the land. And they tend that a big way to solve this issue too is including Afro-Colombian women and indigenous people in planning for infrastructure projects, because so often the Colombian government thinks that they can kind of alleviate poverty by investing in these infrastructure projects in these violent areas. But women, these women of color are kind of systematically excluded from being a part of those conversations. So another thing I want to talk about here is actually going back to, well, I'll just talk about it here, is that with FARC, there's kind of an issue as well of, I've kind of been talking about how they're kind of the pro-woman side of it, but there's been multiple reports from the United Nations and Amnesty International that sexual violence is pretty common within the FARC ranks, even though it's women don't tend to report it. They just repeat the party line whenever they're asked about it. And some agencies report that FARC has institutional policies of forced contraception and abortion. And this is particularly kind of salient to Colombian society, because forced abortion is obviously not a very feminist issue, but Colombian society at large, the government has placed big prohibitions on abortion and made it very difficult for women to get abortions when they want it. So kind of from both of these perspectives, we're not really achieving full bodily autonomy for women. Sorry that I had to go back there. Another one of the solutions to these issues that I think is really hopeful is investing in women's organizations. UN women's groups do a lot of good work in helping kind of these domestic women's organizations to form. And it does a really good job of making sure that these women can band together and use their use that collective voice to fight for economic equality. So to the right, we have a picture of a woman farmer. One of these organizations that I think is so good for showing how women organizers can help overall economic equality for these women is the Association of Rural Women Almaguereñas. And this is an organization of coffee growers, of women coffee growers. And the organization, helped out by the UN Women Council, helps to establish roles for women as economic organizers and developing strategy for using their coffee growing technology and learning about new ways to produce it. So this group essentially proliferated technology for coffee growing throughout groups of women farmers and allowed them to kind of flourish a little bit more and build up more economic dependence. And this is really interesting because the association, AMURA, the Association of Rural Women, was initially really resisted by masculine leaders in the community and by families individually, because they didn't want women to shirk their responsibilities at home. You know, that's the kind of the traditional Colombian womanly duty. They're not supposed to work outside of the home. They're not really supposed to make money for themselves. They're just supposed to take care of the kids. And what after time this did, the association, because it was so successful and it started bringing money in, these women actually report that there tends to be a higher division of home tasks between children and husband and wife, and that they're able to kind of gain a fraction of independence from it. Another organization that I think is really useful for explaining how these extra governmental organizations can really do good things for domestic Colombia is the National Association of Indigenous and Peasant Women. That was assisted by UN Women's programs, and they kind of were another voice within the peace process. However dissatisfied they may be, the organization really helps itself to make sure those women's rights voices are being heard, but especially the women voices of indigenous people and poor people, because that's the essential conflict between FARC and the government, is because they obviously don't think the poor classes are being represented. So one more thing that I want to talk about before I finish is um, just the reintegration of women back into society from the FARC fighting. And I'll go back here again to do it. So the reintegration after we're done fighting, after the peace talks are an accepted thing, it's something that's kind of viewed upon with a little bit of skepticism. So we have a lot of times these former FARC fighters who don't necessarily defect, but they leave the fighting force, and they're brought to these reintegration camps by the government, and excuse me. There are criticisms of these reintegration camps not really doing too much to address the needs of those women, but essentially re-propagandize. And so I've seen things from interviews where it's like the women will say, "Oh, they just taught us," because I've never my whole life I've been with the FARC and I've been wearing baggy clothes, these men's clothes. They taught us when in the reintegration camps that I had to put on women's clothes that were a lot tighter, and I needed to wear heels, which were really hard for me to wear because I've never worn it before. And so obviously a lot of those people who were used to a previous lifestyle were kind of unsatisfied with those government efforts to reintegrate them to society, because there was a fundamental misunderstanding of why these women were fighting for their rights in the first place. So I think Colombia is very interesting in when we're looking at kind of this feminist lens and lens of exporting women's rights worldwide, especially when we're talking about the peace meetings, because that's something that I guess we don't often see that much in history. But the solutions to those issues are potentially not super difficult to implement. Like I was talking about, those women's organizations and real efforts during reintegration to translate fighting for feminism and fighting for women's rights into incorporating women's movements to government activity and political activity. So these are the works I consulted and cited during this presentation. I have a few reports from the UN Women site. It was really useful in kind of figuring out what these main issues were and how the international community looked at these issues that were being fought for. And I hope you enjoyed.